There is a woman in the Old Testament who did something modern psychology would take 3,000 years to catch up to. She didn't confront her abuser. She didn't try to fix him. She didn't wait for him to change. She made a plan. She acted fast. And she moved without his permission. Her name was Abigail. Her husband's name was Nabal, which in Hebrew literally means fool. And what she teaches us isn't just an ancient story. It's a safety plan. By the end of this video, you'll know exactly why her story still works and how to apply what she did to your own situation today. If you've ever lived with someone who made you feel like you were walking on eggshells in your own home, you already know Nabal. Scripture describes him plainly in 1 Samuel chapter 25, verse 3. He was surly and mean in his dealings, wealthy, respected in public, and impossible behind closed doors. That contradiction, charming to the world, cruel to the people closest to him, is the single most common thread in what clinicians now call narcissistic abuse. According to the National Institute of Mental Health, about 6.2% of adults in the United States show traits associated with narcissistic personality disorder. That number sounds small until you realize it represents millions of households where the same pattern plays out every single day. And according to the National Coalition Against Domestic Violence, 1 in 4 women and 1 in 9 men experience severe intimate partner violence, abuse that researchers have consistently linked to coercive, controlling behavior patterns. It rarely looks like what people expect. There's no dramatic villain. Instead, there's a slow erosion, a pattern of control disguised as personality, explosive reactions to small requests, a spouse, a parent, a boss who makes you responsible for managing their moods just to keep the peace. And what makes it so disorienting is that the abuse often isn't physical. It's relational. It's psychological, which means the people living inside it frequently don't have language for what's happening to them. They just know they feel small, depleted, afraid to ask for anything. Abigail lived this, not metaphorically, literally, married to a man Scripture calls a fool, in a household where his temper put every servant, every guest, and eventually his own life at risk. Nabal's wealth masked the danger he created. His public standing protected him from accountability. That is a story as old as recorded history and as current as this morning's news. Now let's go to the text directly because the details matter here. 1 Samuel chapter 25. David, not yet king, still on the run, still building his army in the wilderness, had protected Nabal's shepherds and flocks for months. No theft, no harm, a genuine act of goodwill.
Him at his home in Ramah. Then David set out and went down to the wilderness of Paran. Now there was a man in Maon whose business was in Carmel. He was a very wealthy man with 1,000 goats and 3,000 sheep, which he was shearing in Carmel. His name was Nabal, and his wife's name was Abigail.
That nobody asked him for. So when David's men came to Nabal during shearing season, a time of feasting and generosity in that culture, they made a reasonable request. Some food, some provision, in exchange for the protection they'd already given. Nabal's response wasn't just a refusal, it was contempt. He insulted David outright, dismissed him as a runaway servant, and sent his men away with nothing. That kind of disproportionate, humiliating response to a reasonable request isn't random behavior. It's a pattern. And in Nabal's household, everyone already knew it. His own servant, recorded in verse 14, immediately ran to Abigail, not to Nabal, to report what had happened. That detail alone tells you everything about who actually held the household together. This is where verse 3 becomes the anchor of the entire story. Scripture doesn't just tell us Nabal was cruel. It tells us Abigail was something else entirely. Intelligent and beautiful. The word used in the original Hebrew for intelligent is connected elsewhere in Scripture to wisdom, discernment, and practical good sense. She was not a passive figure. She was the most clear-eyed person in the room, in a culture where women had severely limited formal power. She used what she had, her mind, her speed, and her judgment. David, understandably enraged by Nabal's contempt, armed 400 men and rode out to destroy Nabal's entire household. And this is where verses 18 and 19 show us exactly what Abigail did. She didn't wake Nabal up to ask permission. She didn't sit him down for a conversation he was incapable of having reasonably. She moved immediately, gathering bread, wine, prepared meat, roasted grain, raisins, and figs, loading everything onto donkeys and going out to meet David herself. And critically, verse 19 tells us she did not tell her husband. Read that again. She acted decisively, strategically, and without notifying the man who would have blocked her, because she understood something the mental health field has spent decades trying to articulate clearly. You cannot negotiate safety with someone who has already shown you they are incapable of reason. What Abigail did in that moment has a name in trauma-informed psychology today. It's called safety planning. Safety planning is a core skill taught to survivors of high conflict, coercive, or abusive relationships. And it rests on principles that Abigail applied roughly 3,000 years before clinicians wrote them down. Principle 1. You don't announce your exit to someone with a pattern of escalation. Abigail didn't tell Nabal, not out of deception for its own sake, but because informing him would have removed her ability to act entirely. Clinicians call this risk assessment, recognizing that full disclosure to an unsafe person isn't honesty, it's exposure. Principle 2. You act on your own timeline, not theirs. Survivors of narcissistic dynamics often wait for the right moment, a moment that never comes because the controlling partner manages the emotional climate of the home. Abigail didn't wait for Nabal's mood to improve or for his permission to arrive. She assessed the danger in real time and moved. Principle 3. De-escalation is a skill, not a weakness. When Abigail reached David, she didn't defend Nabal. She didn't minimize what he had done. She named it honestly, telling David plainly that folly was with Nabal, while calmly redirecting David away from an act of vengeance that would have followed him for the rest of his life. David's own response, recorded in 1 Samuel chapter 25, verse 32, was direct. Praise be to the Lord, the God of Israel, who has sent you today to meet me. He recognized that her intervention had pulled him back from a decision he would have regretted. That exchange, honest, regulated, and strategic under extreme pressure, is exactly what trauma-informed counselors train survivors to develop. Principle 4, and maybe the most overlooked, Abigail protected everyone in that household without once excusing Nabal's behavior. Safety planning isn't about pretending the harm isn't real. It's about reducing damage while being honest about what is actually happening. Now here's the verse most sermons skip entirely. 10 days after Abigail's intervention, 10 days after she stood between a fool's arrogance and a small army's fury, Scripture records that Nabal's heart failed him and he died. 1 Samuel 25, verses 37 and 38. Abigail didn't cause that. The text is clear that God acted. But notice what she did not do in the time between her intervention and his death. She didn't stay silent to keep a peace that had never actually existed. She didn't confuse loyalty with self-erasure. She discerned the danger, protected what she could protect, and released what was never hers to fix. That posture, acting with clarity, then releasing the outcome, is exactly what trauma-informed faith counselors encourage survivors toward today. You are responsible for your safety and your integrity. You are not responsible for rehabilitating someone who has no interest in change. So what does an Abigail-style safety plan actually look like in a real life today? There are concrete steps here worth walking through carefully. Step 1. Name the pattern, not just the person. Narcissistic abuse survives on confusion and self-doubt. Keeping a private journal of specific incidents with dates and details about what was said and how you responded turns a fog of maybe I'm overreacting into documented, visible reality. That documentation also matters if you ever need legal or professional support later. Step 2. Identify your people before you need them. In the story, Abigail had somewhere to go and someone who would hear the truth without minimizing it. David received her words at face value. Who are the people in your life right now who will believe you, who won't tell you you're exaggerating or that you should try harder to make it work? Build that list now, not during a crisis. Now. Step 3. Prepare your provisions in advance. Abigail had bread, wine, and resources ready to move before the confrontation happened. In practical terms, for someone in a controlling relationship today, that means important documents, access to some financial independence, and a clear sense of where you could go, all arranged quietly and in advance, not scrambled together in the middle of a blow-up when your thinking is compromised by fear. Step 4. Act without requesting permission from the person who is the danger. This is the hardest step for people raised to believe that honesty means full disclosure to everyone at all times. It doesn't. Protecting yourself from someone who has shown you they cannot be reasoned with is not betrayal. Romans chapter 12, verse 2 tells us we are transformed by the renewing of our own minds, not by successfully renewing someone else's. Abigail did not wait for Nabal's cooperation. She moved. Step 5. Release the outcome. Abigail could not control what ultimately happened to Nabal. She did what she could, and then she let go of what was beyond her reach. People in controlling relationships frequently spend enormous energy trying to manage their partner's behavior, their partner's reputation, their partner's eventual consequences. That energy belongs to you. Here is what the entire arc of 1 Samuel 25 ultimately shows us. A woman with no formal authority, in a culture that gave her almost none, used intelligence, speed, and moral clarity to protect an entire household from the consequences of one man's arrogance. She spoke truth to a powerful man who was on his way to commit mass violence. She did it without her husband's knowledge, without his blessing, and without waiting for a moment that would never come. And Scripture doesn't frame that as disobedience. It frames it as wisdom. The story doesn't end with Abigail still trapped. After Nabal's death, David sent for her, and she became his wife, moving from a household defined by cruelty into a different kind of life. That transition matters. It tells us the story was never meant to end at survival. It was meant to point towards something better. Wisdom and faith were never in conflict in that wilderness. Abigail trusted God completely, and she still packed the donkeys herself.